Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first audio book, Mortal Remains by Henry Scammel. Disclaimer, I'm going to try to get through this efficiently, so it may not be the most perfect reading you've ever heard. I actually have zero experience doing an audio book. This is the first I've ever done, and I plan on just reading it to you naturally, mistakes and all. That way we can get through it in a timely manner. Okay, so let's get started. Chapter 1, Point of Impact. In early February of 1978, a great winter storm was predicted for southern Rhode Island and eastern Massachusetts. Forecasts are usually tentative in the Northeast, where the ocean creates its own climate and can change everything in the last minute. But from all indications, this one was a sure thing. The same blizzard had already paralyzed the entire coast from the Carolinas through New York City, and despite the time of year, the satellite image on the television screen showed the classic whirling cartwheel of a hurricane. Carl Drew loved storms, and at noon on the day it was to hit, when Channel 6 in nearby New Bedford displayed the radar pattern and described the approaching event as a juggernaut, he switched off the television set, got out of bed, and peered out at the lowering clouds over the city of Fall River. It looked good. There was very little traffic. The parking lots at the muffler shop across the street and the gay bar a couple of doors down to the left were empty. Above this familiar panorama, a malignant alien sky was flowing steadily, like cold lava, toward the northeast. There was still no snow, but when Drew raised one of the 3 sooty bay windows and inhaled the air, he was sure it was going to be a big one. He dressed without bothering to shower or shave, added a sweater and his black leather Sidewinder's motorcycle jacket, slid into his stompers, and slammed the door behind him. Skimming down the dark flight of stairs, he bounded through the entryway and out onto the sidewalk, then headed up Pleasant Street at an easy lope, throwing back his head and delighting in the steam of his breath as he ran. Carl Drew wanted to be at Pier 14 in the middle of things when the first flakes began to fall. Pier 14 was a bar in the city's combat zone. Nowhere near the water, it stood less than a block away from its coaxis at the blighted urban center, the headquarters of the Fall River Police Department. The 2 buildings on opposite sides of Bedford Street were within sight of each other. The bar was a gray, decayed wooden fire trap with empty, uninhabitable apartments on the 2nd and 3rd floors. A row of 6 bleak and weathered dormers in the front of the mansard roof stared out over the street traffic. Dopers, pimps, prostitutes, and the circling army of tricks, like the eyes of a giant spider. The police department, by contrast, seemed sightless, slightly newer, but still badly decayed. It was a cubic, grimy, sand-colored bastion sheltering and separating its occupants from the streets it was ostensibly designed to protect. Carl Drew usually started his workday at the pier just about supper time, an hour or 2 ahead of the other pimps, most of whom wheeled their women in from Boston and Providence in their spotless, heavily chromed and white-walled Lincolns and Cadillacs. It was an easy way of anchoring his territory, not because he was afraid of the competition or the out-of-towners, or that he even discouraged them. It was because he recognized that there were hierarchies even in apparent anarchy, and whoever gets somewhere first usually winds up in charge. This time, despite the fact that it was only 12:30 in the afternoon and the day had barely started, Drew realized that he had not gotten there first. As he walked into Pier 14, he saw that someone had already taken up his position, filling his customary space. He appeared to be about the same age, in his middle 20s, but an easy 3 inches taller than Drew's 6 feet. And under his cashmere overcoat, he looked to be about 90 or 100 pounds heavier, too. Except for the bartender, there was no one else in the place. The big man was leaning against the bar, looking up at the television and pouring a bud against the side of his glass, his back to the door. Unseen, Drew crossed over to an empty table on the side farthest from the bar and noiselessly took a seat. "I love these weather jerks," the guy was saying, shaking his head contemptuously at the TV over at the bar and glancing toward the bartender for a reaction. The bartender had not seen Drew either. He was bent down behind the row of beer handles, testing the hose on a keg. It was early, and he was still setting up. The customer didn't even seem to mind that he was being ignored while the bartender's back was turned. He reached across and stole a Marciano cherry and 2 pimento olives from the service tray. He popped them into his mouth at once. He chewed 3 or 4 times, swallowed, and then looked at himself in the mirror, drawing back his lips to check out his teeth, adjusting the lapels of his coat, admiring his reflection as he continued to blow off. How can anyone say what it's gonna do in Fall River, Massachusetts just because it's snowing in Washington, D.C., for Christ's sake? Drew looked beyond him at the TV above the street. A reporter from Channel 4 in Boston was running National Weather Service pictures like the ones he had seen in his apartment a half an hour earlier on Channel 6. Only now, the cartwheel had already spread over Long Island and was reaching across Providence, New Bedford, Fall River, Block Island, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and even the southern side of Cape Cod. The storm is following the same path as the Great Hurricane of 1938, picking up moisture and momentum from the ocean, building in volume and intensity, the forecaster was saying. And just as 40 years ago, this area on the southeast coast, he pointed to Providence, Fall River, New Bedford, is about to receive the full impact as it roars in for a landfall. The man in the cashmere coat bent down and peered toward the window, then turned and squinted at the glass panels. As he did, his eyes stopped for just the briefest moment as he took in Drew for the first time, sitting 20 feet away at the table. The man turned back to the bartender, who had straightened up behind the taps. "That'd be about the last time anyone bothered to clean these windows," he said, and when the bartender still didn't respond, he decided to explain it. 1938. The bartender continued to ignore him. He had seen Drew at the same moment the customer did. He smiled over at him and elaborately pantomimed a double take on his bare wrist. "What, are you early, or did my watch stop?" "Who's been in?" Drew asked. He glanced at the customer, then back at Drew, shaking his head. "Nobody, not inside anyway." The bartender knew that he was asking about women, and particularly the women who worked for Drew on the streets, and he was carefully leaving open the possibility that one or more of them might be working the sidewalk outside the bar, as some of them occasionally did at lunchtime. Drew accepted the information without comment and looked back up to the TV. The bartender said, "This storm is going to kill tonight, from the looks of it." Without moving his eyes from the screen, Drew shrugged, as though to say he didn't know or it didn't matter. The man at the bar had been studying Drew in the mirror. Now he put down his beer glass and said to the bartender, "Come on, what storm? There's no storm out there." Drew continued to watch the screen, but out of the corner of his eye, he could see the bartender looking back at the guy and shrugging. "Yeah, well," he said, and turned to dust off the cash register with his towel. Drew turned back pointedly toward the mirror, and when he caught the customer's eye, he held it. The guy looked surprised by the challenge. He was still not finished sizing Drew up and was uncertain what risks were involved if he should choose to take offense at the stare. Drew decided to make it easier for him. "You looking for something?" he asked quietly. The customer turned from the mirror and stared back at Carl Drew across the room. Drew still had his legs stretched out in front of him and one hand in the pocket of his jeans. With the other, he was brushing lightly at the feathery goatee on his chin, smiling almost invisibly as he waited for an answer. The man glanced behind himself at the bartender for an instant and then back at Drew. "Who you talking to, me?" When Drew continued to look at him, still waiting, he added, "Looking for what?" He still had not made up his mind how to deal with this. Drew stopped stroking the beard, motioning toward the other chair on his table. "Have a seat." The man hesitated. He turned back to the bartender and said, "Give me another, bud." The bartender reached into the ice, pulled out a bottle, and capped it on the side of the chest. But instead of putting it on the bar, he raised the service gate, walked over to where Drew was sitting, and placed it in front of the pre-offered second chair. The man in the cashmere coat hesitated, then dropped a dollar bill on the bar and crossed to the chair and sat down. "Looking for what?" he asked Drew again, only this time more out of curiosity than belligerence. Just as coolly, Drew regarded him thoughtfully from across the small table. "For the same as everyone else. For a little comfort, right?" The big man looked carefully neutral, but his eyes narrowed, and Drew knew that he had guessed right. This guy was a trick, and he had come into the pier because it was still early and there was nothing out on the street. He watched Drew a moment longer without answering, then picked up the bottle the bartender had left on the table. "Right?" Drew asked. The guy tilted his head noncommittally, pouring the beer against the side of his glass. It seemed for a moment as though he were not going to answer at all, but when he finished pouring, he set down the bottle and glanced up at Drew. "You a pimp?" This time, it was Drew who didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in the chair and resumed stroking his thin goatee idly with his left hand, then looked slowly around the bar as though taking possession of the room. When his eyes returned to the man in front of him, Drew saw that the trick was straining to read the message written on the hand. Tattooed in blue ink, with one letter on the base of each finger, was the word hate. "The problem I have with pimps, one of the problems," the guy said, sipping at the foam and looking back up at Drew across the rim of the glass, his eyes still narrowed, "is that I kind of like to see what I'm getting." Drew couldn't have cared less what else bothered him about pimps. He shrugged, ignored the bait. "Whatever I've got is better than what you're going to find on the streets, at this time of the day anyway. And if you wait any longer, with the weather coming, you'll be lucky to wind up with a tall dog." The guy continued watching him and sipped some more beer, weighing his options and perhaps deciding whether it was all worth it. 17, Drew continued. "Pretty face, good body, still in high school." The guy grinned, not in amusement, but sneering and openly. "What do I do? Pick her up at the playground?" Drew did not grin back. He stood up impatiently, juggled a dime in his hand in front of the man's face. "What's it gonna be? I'll call her and set it up now or never. $30. Make up your mind." "Fuck this," the guy said, more to himself than Drew. He stood up, looking angry, and walked across the barroom to open the front door. His coat billowed out, and from behind them, Drew could see the first fine flakes of the storm sifting horizontally across Bedford Street. The man shook his head in frustration, turning back to the table. "Fuck this," he said again. "How far is she from here?" "Not far," Drew said. "Less than a block." The guy looked out the window. "Go ahead." Drew stopped juggling the dime and closed his fist. He held out the other hand to the trick, palm up. "Call her first." $30, Drew insisted. "I'm like you. I like to see what I'm getting." The trick reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 tens. He laid them on the table, but then he placed his hand on top of them. He leaned his weight on the hand, staring at the pimp with stubborn defiance and saying nothing. Drew took it in, making up his mind. Then he went to the wall telephone next to the restrooms,